And some of them, because there wasn't a lot to do in Laos, would run around real quick to get downwind. Well, this bonfire went up. Then, he said the order came down in 1965, which was coincident with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North entering the theater of operations along with Theodore Shockney from the CIA. Burn no more opium. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Store for removal to a more secure location. So guys like Barry Seal would then land and load the opium and fly. And so Nick had known Barry Seal, and then he told me he used to see Barry Seal in Tegucigalpa in Honduras in the 70s, in the mid-70s. And what I learned, Nick didn't say this, but a customs officer who had retired and was pissed enough at the level of criminality that he saw to talk, if only off the record, told me that, because I expressed astonishment, this guy Nick, dude, he's very sick. They all know each other, he said. He said, there aren't that many players out there. They all know each other. There aren't that many players out there. And that has rung true in the 10 years since he told it to me. As you'll see from other things I've done. We have little ears, if that's totally cool. So, blah, 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 blah. I'm waiting for Barry and the boys to come out. So Barry Seal, I discovered, had been a lifelong CIA agent, had flown guns to Fidel Castro when the CIA was supporting him. And that was the first time, a lot of this stuff was the first time I ever learned this, that, and then had flown guns to anti-Castro elements once we had turned against Castro. Had very likely hoped to get away from out of Dallas. I won't go into that whole story, but on my way to Louisiana, I stopped to visit with a husband and wife author team. The husband had been a member of the National Security Council under Nixon before retiring, we discussed. And he said to me, while we're sipping iced tea on the patio of their home in Santa Fe, he said casually, what have you heard about Barry Seal having flown a getaway plane out of Dallas? And I told him I didn't know it. I allowed that I didn't even know there had been a getaway plane out of Dallas, okay? And that's where left it, where he left it, where it was left. But when I got to Louisiana, I now, instead of just investigating the 8 or 10 year smuggling career of Barry Seal, I had to look at the totality of who Barry Seal had been, and that's where I found out about his Galpo and David Ferry connection and the Civil Air Patrol, and how he had done this and that and the other in Laos, and how he had been sent. In 1976, I heard an anecdote. Maybe a few people know who Gerald Patrick Hemming was. Special Forces guy, ran a camp training anti-Castro Cubans in No Name Key in Florida, and his name comes up a lot in connection with Kennedy's assassination. A lot. Gerald Patrick Hemming. So I'm talking to him one day on the phone, and he never told me a thing that I didn't find believable except this. He said that in 1976, he and Barry Seal had been sent to establish a flight school in Eloy, E-L-O-Y, Arizona, halfway between Phoenix and Tucson, set up by the DEA. They were there to set up a flight school for the DEA that was going to train pilots to fly twin-engine planes so they could go to Colombia and come back loaded with dope. DEA was training pilots to fly, this is back in the 70s. If you knew how to fly, probably a single-engine plane. And I didn't believe them. So I didn't put the story in the book. Later on other business, I'm with a guy he and I both know, Brian, God bless him. God bless him. And going from Phoenix to the CIA's base in Marana, near Tucson, and we stopped in this Eloy, Arizona, and go to the airfield, tiny airfield, and sure enough, guys there remember the DEA and the CIA teaching people to fly twin-engine planes, and more than that, they remember C-130s coming in, loaded with drugs that would be unloaded at night there. And so the wackiest thing I heard from a guy, Gerald Patrick Hemming, it turned out to be true. That the DEA was training pilots in 1976 to fly loads of drugs. We were losing a lot of pilots, is what Hemming told me. Do you know how many pilots get lost, he said? You know, previously they had, for the DEA, been flying a lost pilot service. They went around looking for these guys. So now they're going to train them to fly. Blah, 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 blah. I'm waiting in New Orleans, outside New Orleans. I live with Barry Seal's widow. CIA widows don't know what their husbands did for a living, which is all fine and good when they live to ripe old age. But if your husband, if you have 3 small children and your husband is like machine gunned down, on the other side of town one day, you're kind of left with this hole. What was that? Why was that? She wanted to know who her husband had been, and so she supported my investigation. I lived with her for 2 years. She introduced me to every member of Barry Seal's organization that was still around, and there were a number of them, and everyone talked to me because of her, and they all loved her. She's a sweet lady. Furthest thing from a drug wife you'd ever hope to see.
And Danny has the same birthday as Barry Seal, too.
Yeah, July 16th. And now I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
Okay, no, I'm waiting for the book to come out. I'm outside of New Orleans, still at Debbie's house. 9/11 happens. 3 days after 9/11, it was in the news, but quietly, that 3 of the 4 terrorist pilots involved had learned to fly at the tiny Venice, Florida airport. And I went, that's weird. And the reason I went, that's weird, is because my parents, coincidence of all coincidences, had retired in Venice, Florida in the early 80s. My dad had to retire young at like 52. He had a couple of massive heart attacks. They moved down to Venice, Florida's retirement town. And every winter, I'm in LA, 35 years, and almost every winter I would fly from here down to Venice, Florida to see my mom and dad for 4 or 5 nights. And if by the 4th night I was there, I was so restless that I needed to go out for a beer, there was no place to go. And there was nobody to drink it with. Because Venice, Florida, as I later learned, has the 2nd oldest population in the entire United States. The average age is 69. And now we're being told that 3 of the 4 terrorist pilots willingly spent a big part of the last 1.5 years of their lives, hanging around with blue-haired widows. Why would they do that? Thank you. So by this point, I had developed what I like to think of as an unintended expertise in state-sponsored aviation crime. So I go to Venice, Florida, to find out, because we're talking state-sponsored aviation crime, or aviation crime certainly. See what I could find out. And the first thing I found out was that there were 2 flight schools in Venice at this tiny airport. Each one had been purchased in the year before terrorists began to arrive by 2 separate Dutch nationals who supposedly didn't even know each other. Now, by that time, I had made friends with some pretty interesting people. I called one of them, who was a famous Southern lawman, owns a plantation in Mississippi on the wrong side of every issue you could ever think of, except he had a grandson who was a hope-to-die drug addict. And he loved his kid. So he helped me around the edges in the Barry Seal story. I call him and I go, Rex, they're telling me these two flight schools are both owned by Dutch guys that train these three terrorists. What do you think of that? And he said, two separate Dutch boys, and I wish I could do a southern accent because he had a great one. Two separate Dutch boys at the same airport. There's one damn Dutch boy too many. He said, it's untidy. It's untidy. Exact words. So I'm there, I'm poking around, here's what I found. And here's the biggest secret about 9/11 that none of you know, or few of you know, which is that 3 weeks after Muhammad arrived at 10 flight school in Venice, Florida, the owner of the flight school's Learjet